Rite Aid, one of America's biggest drugstore chains, has been having trouble, so much so that in October of 2023, they filed for bankruptcy, and that is a big deal. This right here is a multi-billion-dollar Fortune 500 company that I'm guessing most of the viewers have encountered at some point. But in case you're not familiar, Rite Aid stores are along the same lines as Walgreens or CVS. They have a pharmacy part that fills over 200 million prescriptions each year, as well as a retail part that sells a variety of everyday consumer goods. Now, things are still developing with this story as I talk about this, but it is looking like the plan is to remain open. There are still going to be Rite Aid stores, but they will be closing about 150 of them that haven't been performing too well. They are looking to get a bankruptcy loan, sell a pharmacy benefits manager called Elixir that they had bought 8 years earlier, and use the money to stabilize their financial condition and hopefully build back toward profitability. But I have to say, things are not looking good for Rite Aid. It is hard to believe that this is only the first time that they are filing for bankruptcy, because they have been struggling pretty consistently for decades now, going back to the 1990s. Maybe the simplest way to demonstrate that is by looking at the stock market. If you had invested $1,000 in Rite Aid at the worst possible time, right at their peak in early 1999, it would now be worth less than $1. Back then, this company was valued around $13 billion and has since lost almost all of its value. And lately, it seems like it has been one disappointment after another. People have been requesting I make this video well before the bankruptcy. You do not have to be a financial analyst to know that this is not a healthy looking income graph. They have lost almost $3 billion over the past 6 years. In 2015, it was looking like they were going to be bought by Walgreens until the FTC objected to it with concerns of a potential monopoly. In 2018, it was looking like Albertsons was going to buy them, the supermarket chain, but the deal wasn't approved by the shareholders. So today, Rite Aid remains on their own and, unfortunately, bankrupt. It has been an eventful decline too, filled with fraud, lawsuits, big-time risks, and just poor decisions. So in this video, I want to talk about the decline of Rite Aid while trying to identify 5 of the biggest reasons behind it. The company was started by Alex Grass, who I find to be inspirational. He had a tough childhood, being born shortly before the start of the Great Depression, where his family struggled financially, and during it, his father passed away when he was 9 years old. But by the 1950s, he had earned a law degree and started working for his wife's family, who owned a grocery distribution company. In the early 1960s, there was a Supreme Court decision that said that companies who make products couldn't force the retailers who sell the products to the public to charge a minimum price for them. Basically, retailers were now free to lower their prices, and you could see how that would make things more competitive between them. Alex Grass saw an opportunity there to open up a small discount store in Scranton, Pennsylvania that sold mostly health and beauty aids. To draw attention to the low prices, he even called it Thrift D Discount Center, and almost right from the beginning, it was successful. $750,000 in sales in the first year was triple the amount he had expected, so he continued on opening more of them around the northeastern part of the country. By 1968, only 6 years into the company, there were over 50 stores when he changed the name of it to Rite Aid, emphasizing the pharmacy part of it that was now built into them, and it officially became a public company, raising over $8 million, a lot of which was put toward opening new stores. In the following decades, Rite Aid continued to grow by relying on their hundreds of private label offerings, keeping up to date with computer systems, and maybe most of all, by acquiring various regional drugstore chains to help establish a presence in different areas around the country. By the 1990s, Rite Aid was approaching 3,000 stores, and by that measure, were the largest chain of drugstores in the country. Honestly, for the first 30 plus years of Rite Aid, I would consider it to be a really cool success story. Alex Grass later said, "It's probably the reason I worked so hard and wanted to achieve so much, because I started with so little." I'm not saying everything was perfect over that time, obviously, but turning a small store in Scranton, Pennsylvania into the biggest of its kind without any major setbacks or controversies, I think is impressive. However, in 1995, Alex Grass stepped down from his roles of CEO and chairman of Rite Aid, and that right there is is when everything started to go bad. See, the new leader of the company was actually his son, Martin Grass, and I think that you are going to agree with me when I say that Martin Grass was one of the worst leaders ever put in charge of a large company like this. I know, that is a bold statement. We have seen a lot of poor leadership on this channel, so let me explain. It brings me to the first reason behind the decline of Rite Aid: overextending. See, even though Rite Aid was already the biggest drugstore, the new plan was to aggressively make it bigger. And I am not talking about these various regional acquisitions that had been mostly responsible for their growth up until that point. I'm talking about spending billions of dollars to acquire sizable competitors. Right away, within the year, Rite Aid attempted to acquire Revco. It was a popular chain of drugstores based in Cleveland that would have easily been their biggest acquisition ever to that point, but it was challenged by the FTC for antitrust concerns, so it never happened. But the following year, they did buy Thrifty Payless, the largest chain of West Coast drugstores at over 1,000 locations. When you include the assumption of their debt, it cost Rite Aid over $2 billion, and they had trouble integrating such a large operation into their business. Then I also want to mention, in 1999, they spent another $1.5 billion to buy Pharmacy Benefits Manager, all risky moves considering they really couldn't afford any of it. Rite Aid had to borrow most of the money to make these deals happen. By the end of the decade, Martin Grass had more than doubled their sales, but their debt was growing to an unmanageable level, and they were already having trouble making their payments. They were in an unstable position, similar to what we have seen on this channel multiple times before, but my next reason on the list is where the story really starts getting crazy: accounting fraud. In the late 1990s, when things started going bad for Rite Aid, they started lying on their financial statements to make it look like the company was doing much better than it actually was. Investors read those statements and invest their money accordingly, so tricking them into believing you have high earnings will typically lead to an artificially high stock price. Does that make sense? Well, for every quarter, for about 2 years, Rite Aid was using multiple accounting tricks to fraudulently inflate their net income by $1.6 billion. Those reports, of course, later had to be restated. The SEC called it one of the most egregious accounting frauds in recent history and gave it the title of the largest financial restatement ever by a public company at that time. And this right here, by the way, is when their stock price really started tanking. People did not want their money invested in Rite Aid after learning about this. 5 executives from the company ultimately went to prison in connection with the fraud, including Martin Grass, who among other things was charged with concealing related party transactions that enriched himself at shareholder expense. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison, but released after 6, and barred from ever again serving as an officer or director of a public company. Are you starting to understand why I called him one of the worst business leaders of all time? All within about 5 years, he took a stable, reputable company and put it into danger. Though on the bright side, Rite Aid did do a pretty good job in coming back from it. They brought in new leadership that started closing underperforming stores, they refinanced their debt, they sold that Pharmacy Benefits Manager to help pay some of it off, and by the mid-2000s, their debt had been reduced to half of its previous amount, and they were reporting a profit legitimately for the first time in 6 years. It is actually disappointing because after barely avoiding bankruptcy and amazingly getting themselves back on track, they started making the same mistakes. My next reason behind the decline is overextending. Again, in 2006, likely feeling ambitious and healthy after the big recovery, they announced a new acquisition bigger than any of the ones before it. They bought Checkered and Brooks drugstores and quickly converted them into Rite Aids. For 1 year, they operated more than 5,000 stores. That was their all-time high before they started closing them yet again. It turns out that this was terrible timing. They had gone deeper into debt, again, right before a big recession. When you have $6 billion in debt, do you understand how much interest you have to pay each year and how hard it is to turn a profit when you are paying that much interest? I did a couple of calculations to find out that since 1995, Rite Aid has paid almost $10 billion in interest expense and has reported almost $8 billion in losses. Though I do want to point out that their biggest gain over there in 2015 was mostly due to a tax benefit, and their biggest loss over there in 2009 was mostly from a goodwill impairment charge related to the big Checkered acquisition, essentially meaning that it quickly lost a lot of its value. It is frustrating, right? After a respectable recovery, a risky, poorly timed acquisition brought them right back into trouble. My next reason behind the decline is competition. It is a broad category with a lot of different ways you can look at it, but zeroing in on their most direct competitors, CVS and Walgreens, Rite Aid has been falling behind. You might not even realize how big both of those are. They are some of the biggest companies in the country. They're involved in healthcare in various ways, and I'm not going to go into it because I've already made multiple videos about it. But currently, both of them are considerably bigger than Rite Aid ever was. In fact, keeping up with them has been a big motivator behind some of these risky decisions that clearly have not paid off in the way that they had hoped. In 2018, after failing to buy the whole company, Walgreens did buy almost 2,000 Rite Aid stores because they needed the money to pay off some of that debt. But selling half of your business to a direct competitor does not help you become more competitive. Today, Walgreens and CVS have around 9,000 stores each, whereas Rite Aid is in a distant third with about 2,000 of them. It's the kind of store where convenience is extra important. People will commonly go to whichever one is closer, and for most people today, that store is no longer Rite Aid. Not to mention the competition coming from online retailers and just about everywhere else when it comes to their everyday items. There are some tough competitors out there, and it is hard to keep up with them, especially when you have been in a shaky state financially for an extended period of time like this. My final reason behind the decline is lawsuits. Years ago, there was a big class action settlement related to the accounting scandal and others concerning smaller issues, but the most pressing threat right now is related to their prescriptions. The opioid crisis. There have been hundreds of thousands of deaths from overdoses over the past few decades. It is a major issue and a whole other topic, but Rite Aid is facing numerous potential lawsuits for their alleged role in it. In March of 2023, the Justice Department filed a lawsuit claiming that from 2014 to 2019, they repeatedly filled prescriptions that were medically unnecessary for off-label use or not issued in the usual course of professional practice. Basically, they say the pharmacists were ignoring red flags, obvious signs of misusing the drugs. They even say that the company intentionally deleted internal notes written by those pharmacists when they did notice something suspicious. They have already agreed to a $30 million settlement with the state of West Virginia for similar accusations, and it's likely that they will have to pay a lot more money related to this. They're not the only ones. Kroger agreed to pay $1.2 billion, and even Walgreens and CVS have agreed to multi-billion-dollar settlements. But as we have seen, Rite Aid is in no position to be paying that kind of money, so it has added yet another layer of complications for them. Let me know in the comments, what do you think about Rite Aid? Do you prefer to go there over Walgreens or CVS or any of the other drugstores, or do you just kind of stop at whichever one is nearby? It is a crazy story, even somewhat upsetting. It's always sad to see such a well-known, impactful brand like this be reduced to something that is so much less impressive than it once was. What do you see for the future? Do you think they'll finally get their act together and work their way back up to the level of the others, or will things continue to fall? What do they need to do? And any other thoughts you have about Rite Aid, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.